This is The Path to War, an examination of the course of events in the 1930s that lead Europe into the Second World War. So, in one sense, it is a straight chronological story, the events that are going to take us from peace to conflict. But the guiding question sort of behind the simple facts and dates is, was appeasement ever a rational decision? Appeasement, of course, is the much vilified policy by which Germany was allowed by France and Great Britain to rearm, to violate the Treaty of Versailles, and essentially to give Hitler almost everything he wanted in the 30s before finally drawing the line in 1939 in Poland. That policy, that appeasement, is one of the most vilified and universally condemned decisions in all of history for many good reasons. But what I want to do in this lecture is try and evaluate the reasons for the policy of appeasement and to make the argument that while appeasement was a tragic, horrible mistake, it was not an irrational policy, nor was it the policy of simple cowardice. I think too often people slap a label on something and stop thinking about it. Well, it was appeasement and therefore it was wrong, and I don't need to say anything more about it. I think to really understand the policy and understand why it was mistaken, you have to understand why it seemed like a good idea at the time, and understand that the statesmen who were making these decisions were not necessarily stupid or cowardly or craven. It's that they were making decisions that they thought at the time were the best they could, based on the information they had, based on the very difficult circumstances they found themselves in. Were those decisions wrong? Clearly, self-evidently, yes. But the fact that the decision was mistaken doesn't mean that it was an irrational decision at the time it was made. So, those are the two prongs of this discussion. The story itself, and then the argument to explain the policy that lays behind it. All right, so our story begins in 1933. In 1933, we see the fateful event of Adolf Hitler becoming the Chancellor of Germany. You don't have to be a proponent of the great man school of history. You don't have to be an intentionalist to accept that Hitler is a central figure in our story, and his coming to power is a seminal moment. It's also worth pointing out that Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany legally. He is appointed by the President, Hindenburg, to that position, as he had every right to do. Hitler was the leader of a party which had received millions of votes in Germany and had the largest representation in the German parliament, the Reichstag. Now, granted, lots of the Nazi Party's power rested on intimidation, bullies, thugs, riots, and German politics were a mess. But it isn't like Hitler took power in a coup. Hitler comes to power consistent with the German Constitution. As soon as he takes that power, he begins to dispense with democratic niceties and puts himself on the path to becoming not just chancellor, not just leader, but the absolute dictator of the state. It takes him a little bit more than a year to accomplish that, but by 1934, after the old president Hindenburg dies, Hitler in August becomes the Führer, which is German essentially for leader. And as the leader of Germany, he now assumes totalitarian control as not just the leader of the government, but the commander-in-chief of the army, and the man whose word literally becomes law. So Hitler has achieved his goals really quite shockingly by the summer of 34. 35 will see him beginning to test the limits of the Treaty of Versailles. You remember the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty which had ended the First World War, and the Treaty of Versailles had placed a number of restrictions upon Germany. Those restrictions included territory that had been stripped away, as we've talked about in the past, the fact that Germany could not have any military forces in the Rhineland, which was the border area between France and Germany. Germany's army was reduced to a laughably small number, about 50,000 men. Germany was not allowed to have any warplanes. Germany was not allowed to have any warships. And so Germany was militarily essentially impotent. This was one of the crucial enforcement components of the Treaty of Versailles, one of the ways to keep Germany down. Hitler understands this is not just a great humiliating insult to Germany, but it also leaves Germany completely vulnerable. And he has intended all along to change that policy. And so in 1935, he violates the Treaty of Versailles and begins rearming Germany. At first it's secret, and then it becomes open. So here we have the first instance, the first open, notorious, public violation of Versailles and the beginning of Germany coming back into power. The question is often asked, well, why didn't France and Great Britain intervene here, right at the beginning? Didn't they understand where this was going to lead? Well, no, they didn't understand where it was going to lead. It's unfair for us to use the benefit of hindsight to say that German rearmament leads to the Second World War. We can't hold them to that standard. But should they have known that a rearmed Germany was going to be a problem and that they should have done something about it now, while Germany was very weak, while its rebuilding army was very small? Wasn't this the time? Again, in hindsight, clearly yes. So why didn't the leaders of Great Britain and France intervene here? There are several reasons, and these are sort of the underlying pieces of appeasement that you have to understand in order to evaluate the policy. The first part. The Allies had been horribly, horribly savaged by the First World War. And as we discussed in the earlier lecture on the Treaty of Versailles, they didn't really get much out of it. Germany, Great Britain and France don't have much benefits coming to them as a result of their victory in that long, horrible struggle. And so, having lost millions of men, having almost bankrupted themselves, the politicians and public of those great democracies were very, very reluctant to get involved in a war again. On top of that, there are other reasons for letting Germany rearm. There was the sense among some people that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh on Germany. Why was it that the Germans, alone amongst all other states, were not allowed to defend themselves? Is that really fair? Is that really reasonable? All of the men who had made the decisions that had led to the First World War were out of power. Theoretically, the Kaiser was gone, the great demonized figure of Prussian militarism was gone. Why shouldn't the Germans be allowed, to some extent, the same rights that every other state has? Another argument, a more realpolitik idea, is the idea that a rearmed and re-strengthened Germany is not necessarily a completely bad thing for the West. You have to remember that during the 1930s, we see the rise of the Soviet Union. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union is rebuilding, regaining its industrial power. It continues to talk about international socialist revolution. It talks about expansion. And so there are many in the West who see Stalin and the communists as a much greater threat than Hitler and the Nazis. And so maybe having Germany, an armed Germany, a militant Germany, between the democracies and the communists would be a good idea. Maybe we would like Germany to be able to serve as a buffer state for us. This is this rationale is spoken more in private than in public, but it clearly is informing part of the Western policy. And so nothing is done about Germany's growing rearmament. Later in 1935, Mussolini, at this point very much the more powerful of the two fascist leaders, invades Ethiopia. He's looking for a fight that he can win. He's looking for military glory. And so he takes his new fascist armed forces into Ethiopia. He suffers a much more difficult campaign than he'd expected. The Ethiopians fight bravely and with great effectiveness, but unfortunately they're armed at their best with camels, and the Italians have tanks, and camels really can't beat tanks. And so, although it takes much longer than he would have wanted, Mussolini successfully inserts Italian power into Ethiopia. This brings us to 1936. In 1936, Hitler takes the next step. And that step is another overt violation of the Treaty of Versailles. This is in March, when he begins his first act of aggression by occupying the Rhineland. The Rhineland is this border region of the western part of Germany between Germany and France. It's this sort of orangey color on the map. And you remember, under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany is not allowed to have any military forces whatsoever in that territory. It was supposed to be a demilitarized buffer zone between the two ancient enemies, France and Germany. In March of 1936, Hitler calls the bluff. He just marches in, and as you can see from this fabulous photograph, he does it openly, contemptuously. Bands, drums, guys with goose-stepping. I mean, it's an open and notorious step. The French, see what's coming, want to draw the line here. The French want to say, we are not going to stand for this. We moved into the Ruhr back in the 20s, you remember, to get our reparations paid. We are not going to tolerate this. Let's go. But France is suffering through serious internal conflict, and France doesn't have the resources or, frankly, the guts to take on Germany by itself. France wants Great Britain to approve and cooperate in their action. Britain refuses. Now, we know now, with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of accessing Nazi documents, that Hitler had given the orders to his occupying troops, to these bands and guys who were marching into the Rhineland, that if there was any opposition, that there was any sign that the French or the English were moving in to stop them, they were to run away, they were to retreat, they were to back out. It would have been easy to stop them, but the British are not willing to. Again, part of it is this sense that the Germans have a point. The Rhineland is German. It's clearly German. The people who live there are German. They have German passports. They identify with Germany. They vote in German elections. They're German. Nobody denies this. And as such, is it really reasonable to say the Germans can't put their own army in their own country? How would we feel if, as a result of let's say, the Mexican-American War, the United States had not been allowed to put any troops in Texas? We Americans would consider that outrageous. We would refuse it absolutely. So is it really fair to require that Germany not send its own troops into its own country? Well, you might say, well, yes, it's completely reasonable. Germany had started a world war. And I would not disagree with you. But you can understand the appeal of the argument. And again, you have to remember these continuing factors. The French and British war weariness. You have to remember this sense of a growing Germany, not necessarily a bad thing for geopolitical reasons. You have to also understand that we're in the middle of the Depression here. France and Great Britain are suffering through significant economic problems. Their budgets are very tightly stretched. Their militaries are a pale shadow of what they were. Now, at this point, they're still much greater than what Germany has with its just beginning to be rebuilt army, but they don't have a lot, and they don't have a lot of money. And so there's all these good reasons from their perspective why they shouldn't call Hitler's bluff and stop him from occupying the Rhineland. And so he gets away with it. In the background, happening in the beginning, in the summer of 1936, we have the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. This is a long, complicated struggle which deserves its own examination, but for purposes of this exercise, what we need to know is that it's seen as a conflict between fascism on the one hand and the forces of the left on the other. The Spanish military under General Francisco Franco rejects the results of an election and launches an armed attempt to take power. The forces of the government, the forces of the state, the Republicans resist, and so Spain begins an awful and bloody 3-year civil war. It is a terrible, terrible event, as bitter as civil wars so often become. Germany and Italy very much see this as a test of strength. They see a fellow fascist kindred spirit in Franco, and so they offer a great deal of support. The democracies are much less enthusiastic about the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. They the Republicans certainly have a number of left-wing socialist and even communist forces on their side, and the Western democracies are, again, at least as afraid of communism as they are of fascism. They see no reason why they should be investing a lot of their scarce, very scarce resources to help a bunch of communists. And so while Hitler is pushing on Spain from the fascist side, the democracies, once again, don't take any significant actions. There are individuals, famous individuals who go from the Western democracies to support the Republicans, and there's also romantic stories of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade from the United States, etc. But really, it's trivial in comparison to the support that the fascists provide. So this is going to be going on in the background now for the rest of our story up until the Second World War begins. All right, so now we're on into 1938. And in 1938, we see the first act of Nazi troops crossing the border. Hitler's had several years now to build up his army. It's much bigger than it was in 1935. And Hitler moves to take his own personal ancestral homeland of Austria. The Nazis march across the border and into Austria to annex it into the German Reich. And this is famously known as the Anschluss. It's an interesting argument about whether most Austrians supported this policy. Many Austrians were pro-German and were sympathetic with the Nazis. The Austrian government was not, or at least the individuals in control of the Austrian government, were reluctant to be absorbed and were trying to hold on to Austrian sovereignty. They understood full well that within the German Reich they would be essentially powerless. They would just be absorbed into the Borg. Whether the Austrian people would have chosen voluntarily to do it, they were never given a fair chance to do so. The election to have it happen, Hitler drummed up a supposed excuse that poor Austrian Nazis, feel bad for the poor Austrian Nazis, that they were being pushed around. You remember The Sound of Music, right? Those poor Nazis in The Sound of Music were being oppressed by all those horrible von Trapp children. Hitler, in sympathy with those poor Austrian Nazis, sent in the German army, the Wehrmacht, to protect those Austrian Nazis from being bullied. And once the German army was there, what do you know? We're just going to set up shop. And there was a plebiscite, an election, where the Austrian people were given the choice: do you want to be part of the Third Reich? Do you want Adolf Hitler to be your leader? And they voted overwhelmingly yes. It wasn't what you might call a free or fair or safe election. And so Austrians to this day will tell you that they were essentially invaded and annexed and conquered. There are lots of scholars who would tell you that most Austrians actually were content to join Germany, because at this point Germany looks like a winner. And obviously there's a great deal of commonality in culture and language between Germany and Austria. Austria, of course, for centuries had been the center of a great empire. Since the end of World War I, they had been this tiny little state. Maybe getting back with a winner looked like a good idea. Regardless, it was seen as an act of aggression and a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. And again, the Allies do nothing. Almost immediately after the Anschluss, Hitler keeps going. And in the spring of 1938, he demands the Sudetenland. Now we're talking about crossing the borders, not to a state which might sort of agree to be part of the Reich, but into a state which is clearly separate and sovereign. The state of Czechoslovakia, which had been carved out of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of World War I, sort of hangs, as you can see, sort of as a big thumb into the center of German territory. And the pale color that you see on the border between Germany and Czechoslovakia is called the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland is populated mostly, but not exclusively, by people of German ancestry who spoke German. And Hitler claims that what he wants is to unite all Germans into a greater Germany. Just like Serbs wanted to have a greater Serbia, just like Hungarians wanted to be all in Hungary. All Hitler wanted, he says, is to bring the German people into one Reich. That's all he wants. He wants this territory, the Sudetenland, so that Germany can achieve its proper size. There are a couple problems with this. First, Czechoslovakia is a sovereign state and doesn't want to give up its territory. Secondly, this territory between Germany and Czechoslovakia is mountainous. It's very good terrain for the defense. It is highly fortified, and the Czech army is pretty good. They are not stupid. They understand they have powerful and potentially dangerous neighbors, and the Czechs have been trying to protect themselves. They have a treaty with France and Great Britain to protect them in case of aggression. And the Czechs bitterly resent and are prepared to resist this German muscling up on them. This leads us to the real height of appeasement. In September of 1938, Hitler meets with Neville Chamberlain, who is the British Prime Minister, to discuss the future of Czechoslovakia. And this is a conference that takes place at Munich. Hitler meets with Chamberlain several times in 1938. And at the conference, Chamberlain is trying desperately to maintain the peace. He has lived through the First World War. He knows his country and his countrymen have no stomach for war. He doesn't have the money for war. He thinks that in some sense Hitler's demands are reasonable. If Hitler is just a nationalist, if all he wants is to bring all Germans into a greater Germany, is that such a crazy thing? Isn't it possible that the people of the Sudetenland actually want to be part of Germany, just like the people of Austria wanted to be part of Germany? Wasn't that part of Wilson's 14 points? Isn't self-determination a good idea? And then, of course, he didn't want to fight. Hitler, delighted to discover that Chamberlain is willing to be won over by lies and promises, assures him that the Sudetenland is the last territory that he wants. All he's looking for is that greater Germany, that Reich, and then he will forswear war as a source of policy going forward for decades. Chamberlain takes the bait. Hitler and he signed the famous Munich Accords, and Chamberlain returns to Great Britain declaring peace in our time. He is received as a hero. The people of Great Britain are delighted. Chamberlain famously said at the time that the people of Czechoslovakia are the Czechoslovaks are people about whom we know little and care little. And so, are the British people willing to send their boys to die for the sake of these foreigners with their peculiar language and their strange new country? Are they willing to do it? Are you? If today, in 2015, if Russia were to just drop the gloves and invade Ukraine, a naked, absolute invasion of Ukraine to take the entire state and absorb it back into the Russian Empire, how many Americans do you think would be willing to engage, to accept a draft and to go to war with Russia for the sake of the Ukrainian people in 2015? I suggest the number would be vanishingly small. And that's precisely how the British people felt in 1938. Why should we suffer and bleed and die to help these foreigners? Now, it wasn't all that way. There were certainly some people, some Britons, who understood that this was a bridge too far. And this is a famous contemporary British cartoon at the time, captioned "Goose Stepping Over the Spineless," and you see Hitler mockingly walking over the prostrate bodies of the Western democracies who don't have the guts to stand up for themselves. And obviously, in hindsight, the right thing to do was to stop him here. It would have been difficult in 1938, but the German army was still far from being completely rebuilt. The Czechoslovak army was strong and had good positions, and if France and Britain had intervened at this point, it's very, very likely that the Germans would have been defeated and Hitler would have been brought down. And in fact, there were people within the German army at the time who hoped that that would happen. There were German generals who were secretly communicating with the British, saying, Hitler's going to do this. You need to step in. Just step in. Just say you're going to do it. Mobilize. We, the German generals, will then step in. We will organize a coup. We'll bring down Hitler. And we'll all live in a much safer world. Despite this rather clumsy attempts by the German generals, the British and the French do nothing. Czechoslovakia is betrayed. Hitler despite his promises that all he wants is the Sudetenland, quickly moves, take the entire country of Czechoslovakia and absorbs it into the German Empire, the Reich. Now, Chamberlain, who is so often mocked for being naive and ignorant, is not a stupid man. He understands that Hitler is a potential threat. He has received Hitler's word that there will be no more expansion, but as soon as he perceives that Hitler has violated his word and has taken all of Czechoslovakia, as soon as Chamberlain perceives that Hitler has violated his promise, Chamberlain begins to prepare. And Britain begins to rearm here in 1938. Chamberlain hopes it won't be necessary, but he swallows the political poison, if you will, of calling up soldiers, of increasing military spending, because he understands what might be happening. In a sense, you could say Chamberlain, perhaps he's a gentleman, an English gentleman. He allowed Hitler to give him his word. He accepted his word. And then once Hitler proves that he's not willing to keep that, he's not going to keep that word, then Chamberlain is going to draw the line. And that line will ultimately be drawn in Poland. In October of 38, having now successfully taken Austria, having successfully taken the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, now he turns to his next target, Danzig, the Danzig Corridor. You remember after Versailles, Germany was no longer contiguous. The new state of Poland had been given this yellow territory in the east so that it would have a path to the sea and to the port, the free port of Danzig. And this cuts Germany in pieces. East Prussia is not contiguous with the rest of Germany. Hitler sees this as a great insult. That territory of Prussia is naturally German. It should be taken from Poland, and so he says, well, we need to bring those Germans into Germany. At this point, by 1939, very few people are buying it anymore. Remember, he made this solemn promise that the Sudetenland was the last territory that he wanted, and so Chamberlain in March of 1939 announces that Britain will defend Poland if Germany invades. And on the strength of that demand, Poland, on the strength of that guarantee, Poland refuses German demands to give up the Danzig Corridor. And that's sort of where we are in the spring of 1939. Now there's a real thunderbolt, a real diplomatic shock, because in the summer of 39, in August, the Nazis and the Soviet Union sign the famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is officially an agreement for the two sides, for the Nazis and the Soviets, to refrain from interfering with each other to keep the peace. And this is a great, great shock because, of course, Germany and Russia are ancient and ancestral enemies. Russia, of course, has long been the feared second front of the two-front war that Germany has been concerned about. And so this is a huge, huge benefit for Germany. But it's ideologically shocking. Fascism and communism are in many ways opposites. The two sides had never stopped heaping abuse upon each other. Both sides understood the other to be a great threat to their country, to their ideology, to their way of life. But they do this deal. It's actually a worse deal than was known at the time because it wasn't just a non-aggression pact. It was beyond that. There were secret parts, secret protocols for the pact, where the Soviets agreed to actually assist the Nazis in attacking Poland, and the two sides agreed on how they were going to carve up Eastern Europe between them. So it's more than just a we'll stay out of your way deal. It's a let's cooperate to screw over all of these weak countries between us. This is not so much an example of appeasement as an example of Britain and France really botching the situation. It should have been obvious to them how important the Soviet Union was in these calculations. The Soviet Union, as a practical matter, was the only country that could have done anything to protect Poland and just to deter the Nazis. But in fact, Stalin was very concerned about Nazi expansion. He understood Hitler for what he was, and he understood that there was going to at some point be a fight between the Nazis and the Soviets. Stalin had tried to arrange some kind of anti-Nazi alliance, sort of along the lines perhaps of the old First World War alliance of France, Britain, and Russia. The French and the English had been very reluctant to do this. Again, remember, tremendous ambivalence about the communist Soviet Union. And by the time Britain wakes up, by the time they try and bring the Soviets in, it's really too late, and their diplomatic attempts are fumbling and ineffective, and Stalin, super cold-eyed realist that he is, decides that he can get more from the Nazis than he can get from the British. And so they sign this awful deal. And all of a sudden, there's no one to oppose the Nazis in the East. And so this brings us to the fateful month of September 1939, when, having concluded the deal to take the Russians off the table, the German blitzkrieg crashes into Poland, and this begins World War II. And what this map shows is how Poland is betrayed and attacked from both sides. Notice not just the German blitzkrieg crashing in from the west, but the Soviet attacks coming from the east, carefully coordinated and carving up Poland, which fights bravely but hopelessly against these two giant assailants. True to their word, France and Britain finally draw the line here and do declare war on Germany. And there's a famous story of Hitler in the Nazi war room, and he receives word of the British declaration of war, and he turns with anger to Hermann Göring and says, "Now what do we do?" Hitler probably had expected, he had certainly hoped, that France and Britain would back down yet again. And you can understand why he thought that. For one thing, for obvious reasons, the British had backed down time and time again, and even though they said, "This time we mean it," really, how could you know? But also, there's a real question as to why Britain would defend Poland. Czechoslovakia was closer, geographically, to Great Britain. Czechoslovakia was a democracy. Czechoslovakia had a defensible position and a potent military force. Czechoslovakia had an alliance. There are many, many good reasons for France and Britain to have honored their promise and defended Czechoslovakia, and they didn't. Up until 1939, there was no British-Polish alliance. Poland was run by an autocratic general. Poland's military situation was hopeless, and Britain and France were really in no position to assist Poland. So if you're Hitler, you can really understand, you can really make an argument that there's no good reason for the British to come in. What can it possibly serve? What good will it do for the British to come in and declare war in defense of Poland? That's a fair question. Ultimately, I think the simple answer is that Chamberlain and the British public had really had enough. The scales had completely fallen from their eyes. They understood that Hitler was never going to stop on his own, that they were going to expand and expand until they were stopped. And grimly but determinedly, the British and the French take up the mantle and declare war in support of Poland and accept a war with Germany, even knowing that they cannot defend Poland, that the Germans will carve up Poland with the Soviets, and that then they will be left to fight on their own. That, of course, is the story of the rest of the war, and we will cover that next time.